In this episode, I talk with evolutionary biologist Dr. Joan Strassmann about the wild social lives of birds, from infidelity and sperm competition to mobbing, predators, and living on the edge every single night. Oh, yes, bird lives are full of drama. We also get into cliff swallows evolving shorter wings to dodge our cars, and how birds are adjusting their songs around our noise. And of course, why watching one bird for 5 minutes can completely change how you see the animals around you. You're listening to Wild Connection, where every conversation is a journey into what it means to be part of this wild and complicated world. I'm your host, Dr. Jen, and I talk with scientists, authors, and changemakers about people, nature, and the surprising connections that tie us all together. All right, everybody, welcome back. In our last episode, primatologist Joan Silk took us into the social worlds of baboons and other primates, showing how long-term studies let us follow individuals from birth to death and reveal how early adversity, friendship, and social bonds shape who they become and how long they live. In this episode, we're staying with social behavior, but turning our attention to the skies. My guest is Dr. Joan Strassmann, whose new book, The Social Lives of Birds, Flocks, Communes, and Families, invites us to see birds not as background noise, but as strategic, complex, highly social beings whose dramas play out above our heads every single day. We talk about flight as a kind of superpower and why infidelity in birds reshaped scientific ideas about family values, and how stress, personality, and self-interest show up in avian societies. Joan is a member of the National Academies of Science and the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and held a prestigious Guggenheim Award, and is currently a Charles Rebstock Professor of Biology at Washington University. As you'll hear, birds become a mirror. By learning to slow down and watch one bird for 5 minutes, as Joan encourages, we start to notice stories instead of just lists. We notice who's negotiating over food at the carcass, who's mobbing a predator, and who's living on the energetic edge just to make it through the night. I'm so excited to have Dr. Joan Strassmann here. Joan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to meet you as well, because you've done a lot of work on social behavior and cooperation, even on other species that are a little bit unexpected. But we're going to talk about your new book, The Social Lives of Birds, Flocks, Communes, and Families. I really like to start the show letting people get an introduction to the guests. And one of the things I always like to ask is, how did you get interested in this field, looking at behavior in other species? What was your journey like?
Well, like so many people that really love to work in the field, it was my undergraduate mentor that really formed my path. That was Dick Alexander at the University of Michigan. And he was very interested in social behavior. It was an exciting time where kin selection was just becoming well understood. And the idea that individuals in groups were not behaving for the good of the group, but rather for their own good or their family's good was kind of a new idea. And so I've pretty much always followed that early path from my undergraduate days.
Did you always have a passion for animals when you were young?
I love to be outside. I liked animals. I also liked plants a lot. I'm not a total animal chauvinist. I suppose my real love was really insects, actually, and that's what I worked on for the first half of my career.
That's right. You've done work on social wasps, and now you're looking at social amoebas, which caught me by surprise because I've never thought of an amoeba as being particularly social. So that's really interesting. But what led you to write about birds? Because this is not your first book about birds.
So, one thing that we professors all do besides research is teach. And I love to teach and I love my students and I really want to inspire them. And there's just some things that work better for that than others. And if I were to throw them right in with some wasps or some amoebas, they might not be as able to explore their own ideas without my guidance as is the case with birds. So I've taught with birds for a long time where I've given students very open-ended assignments of go out in the field. In this case, it was the Rice University campus. So they just had to step out the door and watch the birds and try to figure out a question you want to answer and a way to answer it with something you can count. And this is sort of the fundamentals of all science is watch, have an idea, test it with numbers of some sort. And so my books really came from my teaching, not from my research.
That's really lovely, and I love teaching too. And I would imagine, birds are just a really great entry point into this because they're pretty easy to see depending on where you are. Sometimes forest birds are remarkably shy and difficult to see, but they're also pretty dramatic. And I mean, I find this for lots of species. There's a lot of drama going on. It's like a soap opera or, a novella. And birds have, pretty spectacularly dramatic lives, as one can discover with reading your book. And so I'm wondering, what aspect of bird social life do you think would surprise most people?
Um, so the reason that birds are great study organisms for everyone, but especially for beginners, is that they communicate in the same ways we do with vision and sound and things that we can detect, whereas mammals, smell is so important. And we're not that good at that, even though we are ourselves mammals. And of course, we do smell. I hope myself not right now, but so surprising things might be how attentive birds are to their own self interest. That might sound a little crass, but there it is. You don't pay hard attention to what's going to keep you alive, and you're going to be the meal of someone else, or lose out in the mating game, or have some other level of failure.
I like that. That's almost like birds have high self-worth and self-value and self-esteem. Maybe some more things we can learn about ourselves through birds, which is one of the things I really like about the approach that you take in the social lives of birds is making them very relatable to us. And one of the things that your book makes clear is that birds aren't just reacting to things, they even have preferences. And I'm wondering, what do you think about the idea? There's a lot of work now on animal personalities, and most people recognize that or feel that their dog or their cat, if they have multiple individuals, all have different kind of personalities. And do you think that these preferences or personalities of individual birds are there and influence the way that they interact with each other and with the world?
So yes, I think personality is one name for something that we've long known that different individuals do different things. A lot of it has to do with where you are in the hierarchy. And it can be a dominance hierarchy, it can be an age hierarchy. So a lot of these things will define what is the best behavior for a given individual. Um, and in a way, that's the easier thing to look at. Perhaps a harder thing is to look just at some different preferences that may start out as being effective for an individual and then develop more and more effectively in that direction.
Right. Okay. So, well, and we all have preferences. One of the things that I love about birds and the bird research, and I don't know how you feel about this, but you write about this sort of dramatic upending of old ideas, and red-winged blackbirds were the species that really transformed the idea that, birds were just this like loving pair that were super monogamous, and turned it into, well, they're not as faithful as they might have seen. And this probably, I imagine at the time, caused quite a stir in the scientific community. And so, why do you think that the discovery that both males and females, you know, dally about with extra, the formal name, right, is extra pair copulations, which is a fancy way of just labeling infidelity, if you will. So why do you think this caused such a stir or controversy in the scientific community, and why was it so surprising?
Well, I think people that watch birds at the nest and they sort of see the male and the female tending to the young, and if they looked carefully, they would be able to tease out whether the male or the female was doing more to help, or if they were scientists, they might even discover, as I talk about in my book, that males with bluer eggs will tend the babies more because those babies are likely to be stronger. It's kind of the opposite of the prodigal son, where they help the stronger over the weaker. When I think about birds, to me, everything gets back to their amazing superpower. And that, of course, is flight. So they can fly, they can move around, they migrate more than practically any other taxa. There are migratory ungulates, of course, but nothing like what the birds do. And so, given the costs of flight, the energetic costs, they have metabolisms about double ours. The babies need a ton of food, they need a ton of care. It's a very stressful thing to rear a bunch of babies. So it makes sense that most birds have biparental care. And so that may come from flight. The other side of flight is it's really dirt easy to go sneak off in the bushes with another individual, since you can fly there and fly back in a matter of seconds, really.
Mm-hmm.
So, why the males would do this seems clear, because they're getting babies in a nest where they're not taking care of the young. So, that seems pretty cool. And it doesn't really cost their mates anything. Little time, maybe a venereal disease. I don't know. I don't think it's a very well studied area of birds. But his infidelity doesn't cost her a lot. Her infidelity, on the other hand, will cost him quite a bit, because he is then rearing young that are not his own. So the real question is, why does she do it? And at first, people thought, oh, well, she's forced, etc., that it's not really her will. Well, most birds don't really have intromittent organs. And that's kind of a key thing for forcing sex. So, why do they do it has been a big question. One answer is that she is going off with males that might have better genes. They may be genetically stronger in some way. Other ideas are that she usually messes around with neighbors. So she could get foraging rights on his territory. If you look at who females mess around with, it's generally older males. And if it's a singing bird, a lot of studies have shown that it would be a male with a bigger song repertoire. So older males have lived longer. She may be doing it for better genes because she's not getting a lot else out of them. But it is something people are really still studying hard.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've always thought about how, I mean, it's a lot riskier, right, for a female bird to fool around with a neighbor because and I could be wrong, but in many cases if she's caught by her partner, he may abandon the nest because now there's a clear indication that those offspring may not be his. Is that am I on the wrong thinking there, or does that happen?
Well, that makes a lot of sense, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence for it.
Okay. Okay.
And I think one of the reasons is you have to look at what are his alternatives. So many birds are breeding in a very tight time, and he may not really be able to get another mate that easily. And some of those young are likely to be his. So he's not going to be happy about it. I mean, there's a bird called the dunnock that was once touted by Vickers as a great model for humans because they seem to so carefully tend the young together and that it was a faithful couple. Well, they're not faithful at all. And actually, what the male does is if the female has flown off somewhere and he thinks she might have mated with someone else, he will actually peck her cloaca until she squeezes out a little drop of sperm from that other guy, and then he'll mate with her. So that's maybe an extreme version of what males do. If they think their female's been running off, they don't abandon the nest, they just mate with her immediately. And there's actually different shapes of sperm in some birds and some fairy wrens where the philanderer males who may not have their own nest will have a different shape of sperm from the males mating with their own females. So there's still, besides the behavioral level, a whole sperm level of competition. It's
Oh,
crazy.
I know. And this is where like birds are so fabulous because what we say about dunnocks may not apply to fairy wrens, which may not apply to bluebirds or to red-winged blackbirds. And there's so much variation in these strategies. But it's interesting, the human research shows similarly that when a man is separated for some extended period of time from his mate, there's rapid and more forceful reconnection, if you will, when back together. And the motion has been studied as a possible way of excavating out or that kind of level of sperm competition that we're just talking about in the dunnocks. So, here's the wonderful drama about birds, and it gets better. Like that's not all there is. There's all this social aspects, and that's a lot of and different levels of social interaction. And that's part of the title of your book, Flocks, Communes, and Families, is really, we see birds flocking together or roosting together. And I'm wondering, when we see a flock of birds or a flock of geese or a gaggle of geese, we'll get to bird names in a minute. Are we seeing the same individuals in the flock always, or do they switch around? Might they be one day in this flock and another day in that flock? And does it vary if it's a roost versus a flock? And what's the difference?
Well, so yeah, a migrating flock is going to, make the V's and go north and stuff. And yeah, they're quite fluid. They're quite fluid. They're not really partnering up in any way. Now, a roost might be a place that birds go back to repeatedly. So I talk in the book about black vultures. And a given black vulture will tend to go to the same roost over time. So the thing about flocks and roosts is the social contract is really that each bird is looking to benefit itself, not helping others, except if there's family members in the flock or at the roost. So if you want to be in a big group and be towards the middle, it doesn't really matter if it's the same birds as yesterday or not. But to the extent that they always go to the same place, it would be more likely that it would. Now, shorebirds, where there's thousands of them on the shore, those groups are going to be quite fluid.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. I love black vultures. I love vultures in general. I think they're really interesting. And where I am in Florida, we have them. And I always like watching them at carcasses because it seems like there's a whole negotiation going on at a food source. And you talk about something really important in the book, that roosts can be places of information gathering, right? Where you can, and let's say you didn't find any food, but somebody else did, you might be able to get some access to that information when you're at a roost. And I love that section on black vultures. And, it makes me think about how people have very strong feelings about different kinds of birds. And even people who bird have, really strong animosity about certain birds at their bird feeder. And some people really, really hate vultures. And so why do you think birds evoke such strong feelings, both positive and not so positive sometimes?
Uh, I suppose people like common birds the least in a lot of ways. They like imported birds less. So the starlings and house sparrows are not particularly favored. I spend my summers in northern Michigan working on birds and have a lot of common grackles at the feeder, which a lot of people really don't like. And then when I lived in Texas, we had the great-tailed grackles, which people liked even less. And actually, I love grackles. I just think they're fascinating. I like birds that come to the feeders in groups. Other people like the timid little chickadees that will grab one seed and fly off with it to process it. So I don't really know why people don't like birds. But to the first part of your statement about roosts as information centers, they actually work that way a whole lot less than people originally thought. So it's true that black vultures will follow others to carcasses. And that's partly because a carcass is a large resource, more than any one bird can benefit from. And they're only delicious to vultures. You can think of a carcass being delicious for a few days. And so it's a large food source that's easy to share. The actual idea of talking to other birds and telling them where food would be kind of violates that rule of self interest. And it was an idea that was put out there. People liked the idea because it seemed warm and fuzzy. But the research on it in most birds has not favored the idea that they're sharing information.
Right. Well, they might be stealing information by eavesdropping, which sort of brings me to another interesting thing. So maybe you have some insight into this. I'm studying mountain gorillas, and there's really, other than humans, there's no predators of the mountain gorillas. They might face other dangers with snakes, for example. And so I was caught off guard when I first heard a silverback alarm call. Not only was it startling in its volume, and it was fundamentally different than other vocalizations I had heard. And of course, I inquired from the trackers that I was with, and they said, "Oh yeah, that was in response to the bird calling." And I tucked that away, and it's very rare. I've been there, for over almost 3 years. Well, 3 years now, and I've only heard alarm calling by a gorilla 4 times. Um, Three was in response to apparently birds. And one was, well, we were all calling. We called to locate other individuals. Then a baboon called, and then the gorilla also called. So we went in a circle, all 3 different species. So I've known that other species are attuned and attentive to alarm calls of birds. So my best guess was, okay, maybe there's a snake somewhere and a bird called about the snake. But how do other species learn the message that this is an alarm call from a bird? Because it's not unique to gorillas. Other species also, and other species of birds, pay attention to the alarm calls of other birds. How do they know?
Well, it's kind of like natural selection for anything. Those that figure it out and get away from the danger leave more babies than those that don't. And birds are smart. So here in St. Louis, our big alarm callers are the blue jays, of course. And if they find a owl roosting in a tree or something else, they will let everybody know. And I think it's something that birds are attuned to, that they learn it. They hear the blue jays calling. They may go look for themselves and see, oh, there's an owl there. I better be careful. Next time I will just listen to the blue jay. Now, of course, birds that do give alarm calls will sometimes give fake alarm calls to get someone to drop a piece of food or something like that. So you have to be judicious in your responses to alarm calls.
Yeah, believe but verify. But then there's risk in verifying. Yeah. So I think that it's really interesting here in Florida. It's the mockingbirds. I mean, mockingbirds, and you talk about mobbing where birds attack, a potential predator, which is in itself a risky thing. But I have seen both crows and mockingbirds really go after hawks, with a vengeance. And a mockingbird will also, dive bomb you if you are too close to the nest. And a lot of birds have different strategies. Some are mobbing, so, going for a direct attack. Others, they might, one individual might, the audience can't see me, but, like a fake broken wing to kind of distract you over here. So they have all of these really diverse strategies for staying alive, basically. But yeah, that eavesdropping or taking advantage of somebody else's alarm call system. I mean, I guess it's for us too. If a car alarm is going off, initially, we might go, I wonder if there's a problem. And then mostly we just get annoyed because the owner is not shutting off the alarm and there's nothing wrong. But, I guess I kind of want to circle back for just a second when we talked about flight being a really special trait about birds. One of the things that I think a lot of people become fascinated with, including scientists, about bird flight is coordinated flights, right? So starlings, which may not be people's favorite, they're famous for their coordinated movements in flight, or when birds in a flock sort of all take off at the same time. Do we have an answer on how this happens? Is somebody in charge, or is it just like an emergent property of being in a flock?
So the starlings, I talk about in my book that there was actually a physicist, an Italian physicist, who somehow figured out that in those great murmurations of starlings, any given bird only needs to pay attention to 6 or 7 birds immediately around it and move in that way. Other birds, I think, also respond best to those close to them. So if birds are lifting up from the ground because of something seen at one end, you'll often see almost a wave of them lifting up. And I don't think there's a leader. I think that they're all responding either to the threat that they've perceived or to what the birds around them are doing.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and I think next time I go to the beach and I see I don't know if they're skimmers. I'm not sure what the species is. I'm not such advanced birding person to know, but I've seen that where if a person gets too close to where they're resting, there's this, everybody kind of gets up, but they don't all get up at exactly the same moment. There is kind of a wave. And dare I say, if they had facial expressions, probably irritation. But, flight, you also bring up in the book. I like swallows. I like the shape of their wings, and you bring up an example in the book of cliff swallows evolving shorter wings to perform better at avoiding, I guess, getting hit by cars. And so, can you share a little bit about, maybe is there another case that you know of where birds have managed to adapt to things we're doing or things that we've changed in their environment?
Yeah, so the cliff swallow case is really a classic where Charles Brown and his team would collect roadkill, and they've done this for 30 years. And then they also had other birds that had died at the colony, not roadkill. And they discovered that over time, first they realized they were seeing less and less roadkill, even though there were more and more birds nesting under culverts and bridges and along roads. And this has really been causing these cliff swallows to move east. So he studies them in Nebraska. And yeah, then he found that the ones that were roadkill early on were more likely to have longer wings, and that as time went on, they had shorter and shorter wings. And that's really a classic example. And I'm sure there are others, but they don't come to mind.
Okay. Well, how do you think then, maybe adding to that, how do you think birds are dealing with some of the human pressures that we create, like noise pollution? I mean, it seems like, given so much of their communication, as you mentioned when we first started, aside from visual, is also auditory, right? They sing. They don't just sing for themselves. I mean, they do sing for themselves, but in the sense of communicating and attracting others. And so, it seems like constant sound could throw off communication or increase stress levels for birds. How are they dealing with it?
So that is something that's actually been looked at quite a bit. And the way that people usually look at that is they'll take a given species and then they'll compare their singing in noisy environments versus quieter environments. And they will find pitch changes in the noisy environments so that if there's a lot of low noise, then they'll raise their pitch and that sort of thing. So they are definitely changing how they sing according to the noisiness of the environment. Yeah.
Right.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that. Like, I remember when I go somewhere that's doesn't have so much of the mechanical kind of noise. I think that is dominant in many cities, and from the cars and things like that. I'm always surprised at how noisy it is with birds, right? Because you don't typically hear that diversity of sound in some of our cities. I mean, it's so interesting because I think about, you talk about stress a little bit, and I don't want to focus on negative things because there's your book is full of, like these species that are adapting and are some are doing really, really well. But I think one thing that might surprise, well, there's a few things that could surprise people about some species of birds, but stress I want to talk about a little bit, because for the cliff swallows, obviously, having to shift where they are might be a response to their environment. But like birds, and you mentioned this with the high metabolism, I always think of birds are living kind of on the margins. And you talk about bush tits in the book, and you mention how, well, first of all, they only weigh 5 grams, so you're not dealing with a lot of extra weight, and that's a product of flight, right? Because if you're really, I mean, birds have hollow bones, which makes them surprisingly light, even if they're big. And so how much on the margins are birds living energetically day to day?
Yeah, it depends on the species, but birds can't get fat like we can. They can't do it because they have to fly. And so there have been studies that have put birds in paper bags in a incubator at the temperature that they would overnight in. And this is Ellen Ketterson's work, and found that they lose about 10% of their body weight overnight. And then they have to make that up. I mean, yeah. I mean,
Wow.
what if we had a pill that made us lose 10% of our body weight overnight? That would be scary.
Yeah. I mean, every night, right? It's not just one
Yeah.
night, it's every night.
So
Wow.
there's some birds, little hummingbirds, have no fat and they need to eat every morning or they will not do well. So yeah, birds are kind of living on the edge, some more than others. Generally, the smaller the bird, the more immediately they need food. But then they also migrate huge distances. They use fat as their energy source. And if you're collecting birds in the fall, uh, bird banders have a measure of looking at the breastbone and seeing how covered in fat it is. And some birds, like Connecticut warblers that will fly right over the Gulf of Mexico, they will just pack on the fat to make that trip. But besides going over water, birds that are migrating south as they are right now, I saw 2 wintering species here for the first time just this morning: golden crowned kinglets and white-throated sparrows. But birds that migrate south, they can't just eat all the food they need up in Canada and northern US. They have to have stopovers where they can replenish their food. And so conservation of those stopover sites is super important, and maybe little appreciated because the birds aren't at them for very long.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, you know, I know we're coming close to the end of our time, and there's so much I could keep talking to you about. So I hope people go out and get your book, The Social Lives of Birds, Flocks, Communes, and Families. But birders are passionate people. I've encountered a few very passionate, sometimes a little obsessive, especially over seeing just that one particular bird. Um, but can you, if someone, for listeners, who want to start noticing more than an identification of a species, what's one simple way to begin seeing the social worlds and the social lives of the birds themselves? Do you have any tips or strategies for people who might have a bird feeder? What should they pay attention to? What should they look for?
Well, so I did write a book full of little exercises called Slow Birding Journal that can help. And really, the tips are just quite simple. I would start with just finding one bird and seeing if you can watch that one bird for 5 minutes. If you can keep your eyes on one bird for 5 minutes and just see what that bird does, what he or she goes close to, uh, it's really that simple. It's just sticking with one bird, seeing what they do. It's my slow birding philosophy.
I like that. And it's almost like a slow living philosophy, because one of the reasons why I enjoy, not just from a scientific perspective, but personally observing other animals, is in order to do that well, you have to be present. You must be present. Otherwise, you miss like 90%. And so it forces you to be present and take you out of yourself for whatever amount of time. Not that you're not paying attention to things around you, although that can happen. So be aware, especially if you're on the road watching. But I think that it helps calm. Like when I'm in the forest or when I'm watching a squirrel on a morning walk, I'm relaxed in a way that isn't available to me in our day-to-day lives. And so I think, that's a wonderful thing for people to try to do. I'm wondering, kind of our last kind of wrap up question, and your sense of wonder is very contagious. What do you hope readers take away from the social lives of birds? Not just about birds, but maybe even about ourselves.
I think that what I really hope people take away from the social lives of birds is that there are great stories about birds. And I have tried to tell many of the stories. And any bird that you find outside will have a story, and someone might have studied it. So I guess I think that the stories of our lives are way more important than the lists of our lives. So try to pay more attention to the stories and maybe less attention to the lists.
That is such a great thing to leave people with, because it's only through the stories of their lives and ours that we are in my opinion, are connected. We're connected. The things that we are doing day to day to make a living, they're doing. The conflicts, the cooperation, the betrayals, all of it. It's there. And so that means that the skies above us are filled not just with wings, but with communities, connections, and stories. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
That was a lot of fun. And as we wrap up, I keep coming back to something Joan said. The stories of our lives are way more important than the lists of our lives. She was talking about birds, but the same applies to us. Birds are tracking information, managing stress, navigating cooperation and conflict, and making strategic decisions about family, partners, and neighbors. They're not just reacting. They're living out social narratives shaped by evolution, the environment, and their own individual history. In the last episode, Joan Silk showed us that for baboons, the single biggest predictor of a female's lifetime reproductive success is simply how long she lives, and that social bonds, early adversity, and temperament can nudge that lifespan up or down. Today, Joan added birds to this picture, revealing how they too live right on the energetic margins, adjusting their songs to human noise, their wings to our roads, and their social strategies to ever-changing risks. Across baboons and birds, a pattern starts to emerge. Social behavior isn't just decoration, and it's not just for us. It's survival. It shapes who lives, who dies, and how individuals cope with the various pressures that they experience. And that's where we're headed next. In the upcoming episode, I'll talk with Dr. Christine Webb about her book, An Arrogant Ape, which examines our species, one that is equally social, equally sensitive to stress and exclusion. So if today's conversation left you thinking differently about the flock at your feeder or the vultures at a carcass, I hope you'll join me for the next episode, where we look at what arrogance looks like in an ape that can read the data, see the consequences, and still struggles to change course. Thanks for listening.